Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is the podcast where I talk to designers about writing. Today on the show, I am joined by the architecture critic of the Financial Times, Edwin Heathcote. Originally trained as an architect, Edwin was always doing writing on the side, but in 1999, he made the switch to writing full-time, taking this position at the Financial Times, where he has continuously written about design and architecture over the last 20 years. Edwin is also the founder and editor-in-chief of Reading Design, an online library of contemporary and historical texts about design and architecture and urbanism from people like Rem Koolhaas and William Morris and Ada Louise Huxtable and Edgar Allan Poe and Thoreau. Really diverse kind of range of readings that is a great resource for anyone kind of interested in historical design writing. In this conversation, I was really interested in talking to Edwin about both his role at the Times and how he thinks about writing for a general audience and the evolution of architecture criticism over the course of his career, as well as reading design and how spending time with these historical texts that he curates has either changed his own writing or how he thinks about his work and the role of the critic or the role of architecture discourse. This was a great conversation, I think. I love talking to people who think deeply about their own work and also how their work fits into larger historical and cultural contexts. And it's so clear that Edwin does that. And I was really happy to have him on the show. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive email newsletter that goes out at the beginning of every month and sort of expands on the themes of the podcast, previews upcoming episodes, and shares relevant and interesting links and stories about design and criticism and writing. These memberships help with the ongoing production of the podcast, so if you enjoy the show and want to help out, I'd love for you to become a member. Thank you, as always, for your support, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Edwin Heathcote. Something that I always like to ask people who are critics but come from a kind of design or architecture background, something that I'm always interested in is kind of what came first for you in your life. Were you interested in architecture first, or were you interested in writing and criticism first?
Well, I guess there's always a kind of yo-yo. So obviously, when
Yeah.
you're 10, you can't be that interested in architecture. So, when I was 11, I was interested in reading. When I was 18, I was interested in architecture. When I was 20, I was interested in reading and writing. So it's
Right.
always reading, writing, architecture. They kind of yo-yo in and out of favor. But then I decided to study architecture, and I always thought I was going to be an architect. So there was a phase where my reading specialized, I guess you could say.
So where'd the interest in architecture come from?
I suppose it was a kind of synthesis of the things I was interested in. So I was interested in societal issues, in politics. I was interested in the making of stuff. I was interested in theory, in art, in kind of the broader culture. And I guess the closest I could come to a synthesis of all those things was architecture. So it sort of fell into place.
That type of story comes up on the podcast a lot, and it's very much my story also, where I was a kid who loved reading, loved writing. I watched a lot of movies. I liked making things. I took all of the art classes. And then when I discovered design, and specifically graphic design, that suddenly seemed like a thing that connected all of these things that I was interested in.
Yeah, actually, I think the only other option looking back would have been the movies. I never did anything, in
Interesting.
that line, but I can imagine that maybe being a set designer or a director or a cinematographer has some of those same characteristics as architecture. But I chose this path rather than that. I never had any experience with that.
So you studied architecture, and the plan at that point was you were going to be an architect. You wanted to make buildings. Was that kind of where your interest was when you were 18, 19 years old?
Absolutely. When I was 18, 19, the plan was I was going to be an architect working for a local authority, building social housing, libraries, swimming pools, community centers, That was the plan, and then by the time I qualified as an architect, that job didn't really exist anymore.
So what did you do then
Out.
at that point?
So the closest I could come to working, because I was kind of still in my political, relatively radical
Mm.
phase, the closest I could come to not working in the capitalist economy was to work for the state as a conservation architect.
Oh,
I
okay.
worked for what was then called English Heritage, which was the kind of the government organization for historic buildings.
Okay.
And in fact, I worked in the States for a little while as well at the National Park Service in a similar capacity. And then, when it came to when I sort of professionally, I got all my qualifications and everything done. I set up my own practice and I worked in conservation on my own. That seemed like a kind of a good way to avoid the worst excesses of neoliberalism.
Right. I know what you mean. So when you were doing that, and you're kind of working for these other people, you're starting your own practice. How did at all writing fit into that? Did those kind of other interests that you had mentioned earlier, were you finding a way to do that in your practice, or how did that? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like you kind of worked as a architect for like 10 years or so before you made that shift to critic, right?
That's a kind of yes and no answer. I was always,
Okay.
I mean, I suppose that the first thing you have to say is that as an architect, and I think particularly in historic preservation, you're always writing. You're always writing
Mm.
reports. You're always writing kind of proposals. And actually, you arguably you write more than you design throughout
Oh,
your career as
interesting.
an architect. And I think it's one of the things that's not well covered in the education of an architect. I think the writing aspect is broadly underplayed.
Mm.
But
Hmm.
I was also doing a much more formal kind of writing. So I was writing books when I was still quite young. I was editing a magazine on historic
Oh,
church
okay.
architecture and writing a few bits and pieces for magazines and stuff. And then I also worked in Budapest, in Hungary. I'm half Hungarian. My mother was Hungarian,
Oh,
and
okay.
I worked there intending to go as an architect, but actually I ended up as a journalist working for the radio.
Can you talk about that kind of um that kind of hybridity of your early career where you are a practicing architect, but then you were making books, you were writing, you were kind of doing these other things. How did those fit together? Did it seem like, I don't mean to project onto you or onto to your career, but did it seem like architecture was the day job, writing was, writing these books was what you did nights and weekends? How did those all fit together at
Well,
that time?
I would like to tell you that it was a very carefully planned strategy, and that I was transitioning from architecture through to journalism, and using one to springboard to another, and practicing by day and writing by night. But actually, what happens is I was a pretty unsuccessful architect in private practice. I never really had
Okay.
much of a career at it, and I have a pretty short attention span as well, actually. and
Mm.
and I
Hmm.
found that the writing, where you write something, it takes you a day to research and another day to write, perhaps. I found that in a way, compared to a building, which takes you 6 or 7 years to complete,
Right.
and particularly to maybe a preservation project like some of the churches I was working on, it was just a breeze. I found the writing so kind of refreshing. So I found that the writing kind of refreshed my architecture. It gave me the energy to carry on with the slog of building.
Mm. Oh, interesting. I mean, I think we're very similar, to be honest. Where I also think that I have a very short attention span, and um, kind of get bored with projects fairly quickly. I just talked to someone the other day about, I love the beginning of a project, but by the time it gets to the detail work, I'm ready to kind of move on. And for me, and the reason I asked about kind of how they fit together is that when I was working for other people as a designer, I would then go home and basically try to be a writer.
Mhm.
And it took me a really long time to see how those two sides, those two interests could come together, or how they might be able to influence each other. And I guess I guess I'm kind of curious if you felt, not just did it make the architecture work easier, but did it also, were they influencing each other? Were the work you were doing kind of influencing the type of writing that you were doing, or was writing then kind of influencing how you thought about the architecture work?
I think writing for me has always been a form of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as I said, I have quite a short attention span. So if I'm actually forced to write about something, then I'm also forced to think about it.
Mm.
And writing is the medium that allows me a kind of an extended thinking period about it, rather than just a kind of a flashing Twitter thought.
Right.
So I think that to that extent, writing was always a part of my practice. It was only that later I realized that actually writing was, my practice, to use an art term, which is a bit precious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I realized actually that the medium of writing, was much more sympathetic to me than the medium of architecture. And I absolutely love
Hmm.
architecture. And I think my slog through architecture training and then working as an architect has made me a lot less cynical. I'm able to
Mm.
see something that is built and that is excellent, and I not only enjoy the building, but I have terrific admiration for all the people who made it, who designed it, facilitated it, paid it, and built it. I think it strips a layer of cynicism away. I think if you're just a critic arriving maybe without that background, you can be a bit more. I don't want to say superficial, because I don't want to dismiss critics who are not architects,
Hmm.
but I think there's a level of respect or admiration which comes from actually having done it, which helps not just in the knowledge, but helps you um, with a kind of empathy.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Where you have this understanding of the process in a way that, if you didn't study that, you do just see that kind of building at the end.
Yeah, and I think there's no reason that there's no reason that makes you, that the way I did it makes you a better critic. I'm not saying that at all.
Right.
I think it just gives you a kind of a slightly different angle, which is maybe a little more um, forgiving in a way.
You had mentioned that it was only later that you realized that writing was your
Mm.
practice, or writing was your way maybe to kind of stay in this world that you loved, but from a different perspective. How did you how did you arrive at that, or when did you kind of realize that maybe writing was your thing?
Well, I think slowly. So I was still practicing even when I started writing for the Financial
Mhm.
Times. I think I still had the kind of tail end of my practice left.
Mm.
It was a case of the writing being an easier way of making money, and the architecture kind of
Right.
fading away. So what happened was I just noticed that most of my income was coming from writing, and most of my debt was
Oh,
coming from
interesting.
architecture. So it was a kind of fair
Right.
decision to see which way my life was going.
I mean, it's so interesting because that is not what you normally hear. You normally hear that there's
I
there's
know.
no
So
money in the writing side.
exactly, and I think when you find yourself earning more writing than doing anything, then you're an absolute failure at anything else. Because writing is itself extremely badly paid, as we all know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but maybe having said that, I think 20 years ago, when I started seriously writing professionally, maybe it was a bit easier to make a living than it is now. Now there are
Right.
the pay hasn't gone up effectively in the 20 years I've been doing it, and there's a lot more competition and a lot of free stuff out there. So it's quite it's a difficult time to be doing it now.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that, but I have one other question just to kind of finish this thread
Sure.
for a second. So you take this job as the architecture and design critic for the Financial Times. How did that? I guess I kind of have two questions around that. I'm kind of curious how that happened. Was that something that you were, again, kind of consciously interested in moving your work in that direction? And then also, the kind of sub question is, is the writing for the Financial Times different than that kind of writing that you were doing in your early career, that maybe was a little more connected to your practice and to conservation?
Yeah. You obviously, before that, I was writing a much more specialist kind of writing.
Right.
And the
Right.
architectural journalism was a lot more specialist. It was aimed at architects and predominantly at people in preservation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, that was interesting. But I think I always had a desire to communicate to a broader audience. Um,
Okay.
and the FT was that. So it's as simple as that. I think I always wanted to communicate to not a specialist audience, because I think architects have
Mm,
their own. So architecture is not necessarily short of critics, and architects themselves can write very well and criticize very well. But I think the place for a critic is in the broader culture promoting architecture in a way.
right.
I think one of the problems that the newspapers face is a kind of marginalization of design. I think
Mm,
architecture is relatively lucky that it's seen as a part of culture, and a big new museum opening or an opera house opening is given a kind of a decent slot, and it's something that seemed to be interesting to a broad audience. But I think all of the newspapers struggle when it comes to design. It somehow gets stuck between the style section, and real estate, and kind of
right.
culture, and the sort of commercial end of what kind of new chairs came out of Milan this year, and even the sort of fashion maybe pages. And I think that
Right.
part of the reason I did reading design was to create a forum where all of design, from the kind of most marginal practices, could be brought together. But I think in the newspapers, it's something that hasn't quite been resolved. There aren't really design critics. There are architecture critics, and there
Right.
aren't really design critics. And I'm not suggesting that there ever was a golden age where this was done absolutely right, whether it was the 50s or the 60s or the 70s.
Hmm.
But I
Hmm.
think there might have been a moment in the 80s when kind of there was an idea that fashion and music and album covers and graphics and architecture and restaurant design and chairs were all kind of part of a continuum. And there was a sort of
Right.
there were popular critics writing, seriously about this stuff, but in a way altogether, along with music and broader popular culture, film. And I think that's slightly lacking now. I think now maybe culture is still a little segmented. I think curiously segmented. I'm not sure why that is. Whether it's the editors, whether it's the formats. So I think that's my little gripe.
Can you talk more about that actually? Because that's something that I'm really you touched on a couple things that I'm really interested in. I'm especially interested in the people, and I think you're one of these people who can write about a specialized field for a general
Mm-hmm.
audience, who maybe don't know anything about that thing, but then somebody who is involved in that field or profession can also read it and get something out of it. There's this kind of writing for multiple kind of levels of knowledge. How do you kind of think about that, or is that something you're conscious of writing, knowing who the Financial Times readers are, but also knowing that probably architects are going to be reading this?
Yeah, yeah. It's a little tricky, but I think I've kind of metabolized it to the extent now that I don't
Okay.
particularly think about it. And actually, the problem for me is the other way around. The problem now for me is writing for an architecture journal,
Hmm.
where I
Hmm.
have to write
Yeah.
for a specialist audience and not necessarily explain everything. Which isn't quite an answer to your question, but I think the question you ask is interesting and valid, because um, everyone actually understands an awful lot more about architecture than they think. They just may not know the
Mm.
names and the terms, but obviously we all live amidst and around buildings and in buildings. And actually, if you're writing for the Financial Times or the New York Times or the LA Times, or whoever it might be, the big international newspapers, then the people who are reading the culture pages also go to galleries, they go to the opera, they
Mm.
travel widely, So you're
Mm-hmm.
not starting from zero, actually.
Speaking of audience, and how you were kind of talking about how you always thought the critic's position was for that more general audience. I'm curious how what you see as your position between architects, developers, city planners, and that audience. Do you see yourself as you mentioned the word that you're kind of wanting to promote these things. Do you see yourself as someone who is kind of interrogating or critiquing them? Are you explaining things? What's that kind of relationship like between this triangulation between the profession, the audience, and you as the critic?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you raised my use of the word promote, which was it was the wrong word. You're absolutely right.
Oh,
It
okay.
makes you sound like a kind of like a PR shill or something. Uh,
Right. I mean, I knew that's not what you meant, which is kind of why I wanted to come back to it.
I think probably the word is communicate, but also
Mm,
to make people aware and to raise what you see as the issues around
mm,
architecture. So I think sometimes, ironically, it's not the architecture that's the most interesting thing. It's the forces and the conditions that have led led to that particular piece of architecture being built.
right.
And I think that's where criticism can be more interesting in a way, because if you simply critique a building, with very little context, you're
Hmm.
actually confining the people who are going to read it. They're only the people who are really either involved in that building in some way, or living in that city, or have are thinking of going. What you
Hmm.
need to do is to tell a story of how that building came to be, why it's interesting. One of the things that I think my editors always used to say is, why should I be interested in this?
Right.
And it's a very simple and very clear message. What is interesting here. And sometimes the building may not be interesting, but the conditions that led to the building may be absolutely fascinating, or the kind of particular set of circumstances around the construction or the design. Maybe it's symbolic of a broader trend, or broader lack of
Right.
some kind of thinking. So I think there's always the key is always to pick something up around a building that makes it interesting to a broader audience than the people who are just interested in the specifics of that one building.
Right. Yeah. I mean, before we started recording, we were talking about Hudson Yards, which
Yeah,
probably by the time this episode comes out, you will have already written
yeah,
about. But what I found so interesting about those reviews or those essays around Hudson Yards is how little writing there actually is about what these buildings actually
yeah,
are. The interesting thing with that is everything around
yeah.
it. And I'm kind of curious what your process,
Yeah.
I guess, is kind of like how do you think about that? Are you kind of going to visit these and are you looking for what is the bigger thing here? Do you go in with some ideas already? What's that kind of like as you're starting to frame an essay or a review?
I suppose if you're traveling to see a building, it's already hooked your interest in some way. So
Mm,
you
right.
already have the conditions laid down for some kind of broader story. But then you go there, you discover what you can, you see whether it works in the way it should, or in the way you thought it would. You try and understand whether it's adding something to the culture of architecture or the culture of that particular place.
Mm,
You try and understand whether it's something that might be transferable in some way. Is what you're seeing something that might have tips or uses, beyond that particular place? Is this something that's very particular to that one corner of that one
right.
city, or actually is this something that we should all be looking at and seeing how they've done it, and either trying to emulate it in some way, or doing the exact opposite?
Right. Right.
I mean,
How
it's
ha-
vague, I can't honestly say that I have a kind of plan that I go. to see a building, and I
Right.
have a way. There's no kind of one way I do it. Um,
Okay.
I go. I honestly, it's quite, in a way, it can be quite superficial. You go, you walk around it, you talk to the architects, you talk to some people, you try and kind of come back at night. You see whether the place is buzzing or not, or you see what the context is, what it might do to the context. Um,
Yeah.
but in a way, there's also a kind of superficiality that comes hand in hand with that. If you're a critic visiting a thing once, and then
Right.
writing about it before often it's even opened, I'm also aware that there are issues, around that you end up writing about the object rather than the effect.
Do you ever go? This is probably a weird question. Do you ever go and visit a building and you kind of have a plan, you have a story you want to tell, and then as you're writing, you go back, to your desk or whatever, and you start writing and you realize, I'm kind of coming back to what you're saying about writing being a form of
Yeah,
thinking for you. As you're writing, you realize like, oh, this is actually about this other
yeah,
thing that I completely didn't see when I was at the site.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's when you exactly. I think you're absolutely right. It's quite often that I'm sitting in a hotel room somewhere, and as I start to write, I'm thinking, how do I begin this? What is going to hook the reader's attention? And as I'm thinking about how to begin it, I think about something else that's in the
Mhm.
same world, and I think, actually, there's something happening here. This is part of a bigger picture, and that's the thing that allows you to make it into a story in a way.
You mentioned earlier about how much writing and even specifically criticism has changed over the course of your career. And I would like to talk more about that. And I'm especially curious about how not just social media and the kind of rise of Instagram and how there's just this kind of visual culture around design now, how that has changed being a critic, but also just being online, having not just these kind of major publications, but the blogs and specialized sites, and everybody's kind of writing about design as this kind of buzzword right now. Has that changed your own approach to writing or to criticism?
Um, no, I don't think it. I
Oh,
don't think it's changed my approach. Uh, on
okay.
the other hand, I do think it's a good thing. So this kind of atomization of the media
Hmm.
um, is is an interesting phenomenon, and people it allows everyone to become a lot more engaged in it, and everyone to
Mm,
become a critic, and people to emerge as critics who wouldn't have otherwise emerged, because there are so few actual jobs in this world. So few
right.
people, like me, who are um, paid to do this, that it opens up a whole new kind of constellation of voices. Most of whom are probably just destined to stay in their bedrooms, but a few of which are do become really excellent critics, and even if they never do it for they never become paid critics, just their voices add to the culture of criticism, which I think is a very
Mm,
healthy thing. But there has been, the other side of the same coin, I think, is the concentration on images,
right.
which is very compelling, and I'm absolutely as enthralled to it as anyone in the world.
Yeah.
We all love a picture of a 1970s Yugoslav memorial or whatever it might be.
Right.
Um, at one point, it allows you to discover things that you absolutely never would have seen before. People posting amazing things from Chile and from Hong Kong, wherever it might be. Um, but it also encourages a kind of swiping, culture.
Right.
Um, and I think um, the the critic, in a way, the role of the critic is to re-engage the intelligence and to make you
Mm,
work a little. And I think sometimes there's an argument that even though I and a few colleagues are working in the non-specialist medium, that we need to make people think about architecture and actually make some of the pieces a little chewy, make them a little bit difficult occasionally, and challenge people to understand that architecture is an extraordinarily complex confluence of influences and conditions. And I think that's in a way the proliferation of the visual culture of design is a good thing, but it needs a counterbalance of a kind of broader, intelligent kind of critique as well to keep it in check.
It's something I think about all the time. I teach a couple design history
Mm.
classes, specifically graphic design history classes, and I have realized over the years that my students have a much stronger visual knowledge of both design history and design trends because of things like Instagram and Pinterest, where this stuff can kind of go viral.
Yeah,
Um, and they pull from all of these things in when they're making work, and it's really cool to see. But then on the flip side, I struggle to think, okay, this is great that you're aware of these styles, of these
yeah,
visuals. Um, how do we add context to
yeah,
that? How do we start to then kind of explain why these things look the way that they
yeah.
do, um, and come from a specific time? And I find that balance very interesting, and has become a kind of recurring theme for me in my own teaching practice of, yeah, I want you to like look at all of this stuff, but then we also need to have this kind of time for reflection, you
Well,
know?
I remember when I was an architect, going into a job that I was working on to talk to the client, who was a very wealthy individual, and going in with an interior designer. And I had with me a roll of drawings, which probably represented a couple of thousand hours of work. And we had a kind of report on the site conditions, on the history of the
Mhm.
site, on the kind of the social and political context of the building. And the interior designer came in with a mood board of some
Yeah.
pieces of fabric, a couple of coat hooks, and some photos from copied from, I think, World of Interiors. And I later realized the designer was on about twice my rate. And, and I think there has been, there is a mismatch between, one between these two cultures, and the culture of the mood board is the culture of now.
Right,
I think
right.
some of our job is to, as I was saying earlier, is to kind of just become a kind of counterweight to to this huge proliferation of images. I mean, the statistics on how many images are how many pictures have been taken and uploaded every day it's eye-watering. It's almost unbelievable. I think every week there are
Yeah.
more than in the whole history of 20th century photography.
Yeah.
So I think we have a responsibility. People like us who write and read and think have a responsibility to kind of just tone down the visuals a little.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I don't mean to make this about me or make this some sort of meta conversation, but that I feel like that's kind of part of the goal of this podcast, honestly,
Right.
is that these are like long form conversations that hopefully go a little bit deeper than, as you were saying earlier, just a tweet thought.
Yeah.
um, and that they are a little bit harder to just share or to clip, and I think there's something that's actually kind of nice about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think, I actually say all of that because I think it's a good transition into Reading
Mhm.
Design, the site that you co-founded and edit, because I think that is very much doing what you're talking about, where that is a very quiet, very word-driven site. Where can you, I guess, for people who don't know what it is, can you kind of describe what Reading Design is, and then also where the idea came from and what your goals for it are?
Sure. Well, Reading Design is a non-profit, free-to-access online archive of writing on design.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's and the idea was to pull together texts, both historic and contemporary, from everything from from graphics through
Mm-hmm.
architecture, fashion, product design, industrial design, even social design and service design, even potentially, and have a kind of text database that I felt was lacking. The
Mm-hmm.
internet, we all people my age have a kind of ambivalent relationship with the web, um, where I am absolutely as addicted as anyone else to everything on it. But
Yeah.
I'm also
Yeah.
slightly wary of its
Right.
limitations. And I'm saying this, I'm telling you this in a converted garage, in which the walls are double lined with books. I'm completely ensconced. It's
Right.
like a kind of coffin of text that I'm talking to you from.
Yeah. I love that.
And the idea behind it really was that I'd talked to some younger people. We'd done some crits, and I'd been back to my old university to talk to some of the students, and I'd realised that that generation who was kind of beginning architecture school and moving through it really hadn't read very much. Maybe
Mm.
I hadn't either, but my impression was that we had probably read a bit more because we had fewer distractions in those days. There was,
Yeah. Yeah.
there were books and there was TV and music, but there wasn't all the other stuff that you can kind of have on your laptop and your phone. So
Mm-hmm.
I it seemed to me that the internet is this miraculous thing that has endless storage, endless capacity for storage. Unlike kids today have to move around a lot. It's the lifestyle is maybe not as stable as it used to be. They maybe don't want to be dragging books with them everywhere, and yet there
Right.
is this facility online to have as much storage as you want. And people use the internet in a particular way. They dip in. They're just looking for something now, and they want to just dip into a text, maybe read for 5 minutes, whatever it is. And the
Right.
reading design really was that you would always have somewhere to go back to pick out an interesting text on whatever you were thinking about at that moment, whether it was William Morris or Henry David Thoreau or kind of
Mm-hmm.
Rem Koolhaas and contemporary design. There'd always be something there that would kind of spark your interest that would then link to something else that you wouldn't have otherwise found.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you said that. Just talking about like William Morris versus Rem
Yeah.
Koolhaas, and I think the range of the site is actually really fascinating. Do you have a sort of editorial or curatorial goal or point of view? Like, how do you know, or how do you kind of
Yeah.
decide what goes on the
Well,
site?
there's a the public facing answer to that would be of course, and it's to do with what is interesting and what is still relevant from history, and what bits we might have missed, and what's the most interesting material available now. And the realistic actual answer is that we try to put one text up a week, and there's two of us doing it. And I
Okay.
tend to kind of struggle I tend to bookmark things. I think this will be interesting to come back to. And we struggle with getting copyrights, with what is a thing,
Right.
what isn't, with chasing people down. We struggle with length because I don't really want to put academic book chapters on there because it's too much. Um, so you're
Yeah.
looking. It's actually quite the reservoir is can be surprisingly small, but then you have the whole of history and the whole of the world to plow through. So we've only just scratched the surface.
Has working on the site and kind of reading things, thinking that you're going to put them on the site, has that changed your own reading habits, or has it even changed your own kind of approach to writing, kind of as you're reminding yourself of all of these historical
Mm.
texts and kind of being able to put things in context in a different way? Does it change your
It
work in
has
any way?
changed my reading, and that was absolutely deliberate. So part of the reason for setting it up was precisely to force me to read more text. So
Mm.
I thought the worst that can happen is that at least I will have read a load of interesting things. and
Right, right. I
and
love
that
that.
if it's not a success and if no one picks it up, well, at least I will have had some interesting reading. As it happens, I think it has. People have found it relatively interesting, so we kind of we carry on. Has it changed my own writing? That's quite interesting. I think no is the answer, but it has certainly made me aware of the way writing has changed. You know, there's a particular moment in the
Mm.
early 20th century where everyone is writing manifestos, and you know, I find absolutely we have a lot of manifestos on this site, and I find it fascinating how um, it seems almost inconceivable now to have the arrogance to say this is what we should do. You know,
Right.
we don't
Right.
even presume to know what all the solutions are now. So I think what it's done is to underline how quite how different history can be from the present moment, and occasionally quite how similar the problems that everyone's facing is. You know, whether it's Thoreau or Morris talking about freedom and the value of craft and automation of industry, or whether it's the Russian constructivists writing their manifesto on what
Right.
should be done.
I'm going to ask you a big question, so I
Okay.
apologize in advance. But as we're talking about your reading habits and talking about these texts, I'm curious, who are some of your favorite uh, writers or critics or the books, um, either that you've kind of read for the site or just in general, who have kind of really influenced how you think about architecture and your work as a
Right,
critic?
right. That's quite easy to answer. I think
Okay.
the most influential writer I think is Michael Sorkin, and probably
Oh
my
yeah.
style is nothing like you know, I don't have anything in common with his writing, but he is and he was the most um, fierce critic of the way things were in
Hmm.
New York. In the, certainly when you know first went there in the 80s and 90s, and he manages to do what I think I suggest people should do and don't often do myself, which is to you know to bring in the politics, the social conditions, the kind of the popular culture around any issue, and absolutely nail the thing. And he's funny, and he's humane, and he's warm, and he's almost
Yeah.
always right. And I think that's you know
Right.
so I think even though I wouldn't necessarily model myself after him because he's a particular kind of voice, I think you know, he always excited me. I'm always happy to read him. And in a way, then on the other side of the table, as it were, is Rem Koolhaas, who I
Yeah.
maybe never agree with, but he's always compelling, always brilliant, always funny, and you know, I think he's one of actually one of the very few architects who's constantly provocative, constantly interesting, and I think he
Right.
has probably a quite short attention span too. So he has the thing where he, you know, he does a
Yeah.
building, but you get the sense that he's kind of bored of the building before he's done it, and he's already curating the next exhibition or writing the next book, and he's, you know, he's seeing where the next thing is happening. And he's like he may well be wrong. The
Yeah.
next thing may not be happening where he is, but he is always already in the next place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And Rem has been someone who was very influential on my
Mm.
thinking around being a practitioner and a
Yeah,
writer and how those can fit together. And I think he's been uh is kind of the
yeah.
model of that. I actually recently talked to Rainier de
Mhm.
Graaf for the podcast.
Actually, great.
And we kind of talked about that because I think he's the
Yeah, yeah.
same way. And not to bring up another interview, but I also recently talked to
Yeah,
Oliver Wainwright. Um, and he mentioned Rem, and he mentioned, which I think might prove what you were just saying, that when he went to visit, he toured the one of the Prada
yeah.
buildings, and with
Mhm.
Rem. And Rem like kind of took him to one section, was like, I think this is basically all you really need to see. Kind of like he was done with it, kind of
Yeah,
bored with it already. So you might be onto something.
yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely.
My last question is, I'm kind of curious about what you're thinking about right now. What are the things you're interested in that you want to write more about that's on your mind at
Yeah.
the moment?
Well, I suppose there are two answers. The first is that after writing for a newspaper for 20 years about the same thing, you begin to get a little restless, and you begin to look at whether there might be other ways of writing about architecture than the building critique.
Mm.
And you occasionally get opportunities to do it, but not that often, actually. And I think that you in the newspapers you can get caught in a kind of 1,200 word box, which can be quite difficult to escape from. I was lucky recently. I had an opportunity to write a long piece about Milton Keynes, which is a British new town from the 60s and 70s, and it's broadly a huge success, but it has its failures as well. And I was able to really write a long magazine piece, which was kind of obliquely about the architecture. So I guess in a way, you look for other ways of writing about architecture, whether it's fiction, short stories, whether it's a longer social analysis. So that's the answer to the first part. And I think you had a second part to the same question. Oh yeah, what am I interested? There are a few things I'm interested in at the moment. I think one is I had a kind of a moment of clarity. I had a couple of trips. I was in the Gulf. I think I was in Doha and then Dubai, and then I was in Texas, in Houston. And so I had these few days where I wasn't really able to walk anywhere. I was just going in Ubers, and I was going from one kind of air-conditioned hotel lobby to another. And I realized that actually we're all doomed, and that the idea that we're ever going to reduce our consumption, our energy consumption, is just completely fantastic. It's never going to happen, clearly. So we are going to have to plan for doomsday, and I think that's the kind of the thing that interests me now is really. I know this is terribly controversial, but the kind of the tinkering around the edges of sustainability is I think problematic at this point. There needs to be a huge political solution, or we need to kind of plan for a kind of post-apocalyptic scenario. That's interesting to me now, and I think the kind of flip side of that is I have never in my life been interested in the countryside. I'm completely urban. I'm only interested. In fact, I feel quite kind of jumpy in rural locations where I can't get a decent espresso or see life walking by. And I find myself getting a little more interested in trees and birds, and I can't quite explain that. I think it must be age. I find that I look out and I look out at the squirrels in the tree from my dining table, and it makes me very happy. And I think I'm reading about trees and about evolution in cities and about how animals are adapting to life in cities, which is really absolutely fascinating. I have no idea whether this is something I'm going to be able to write about or not, but it's certainly kind of refreshing my imagination. In a way, it's the antidote to the kind of doomsday scenario.
Again, I think we're kind of similar in that regard, in that I have always been a city person. I grew up in the suburbs, but my entire adult life has been in kind of major urban cities. And over the last year or so, I've felt a certain romance for the country that I had never felt before. And maybe maybe that's the influence of Rem again, actually.
Oh,
I'm not
of course,
sure.
Yeah. Rem and the countryside. Yeah, of course. I hadn't made that connection, but you're absolutely right. He is, like I said, wherever you go, he is already there.
Right. I love it. That also allows us to end this not on a completely doomsday note where I thought this was going to end for a second. Edwin, thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation for me. I'm a big fan.
Thanks.
And so thanks for being on the podcast.
It was an absolute pleasure.
This episode was recorded on March 20th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.